So Donald Trump said something pretty extraordinary on Friday. I mean, it was extraordinary even for him. He was speaking at this Republican Jewish event. And this is what he said. Now, he's speaking again to a group of Republican American Jews. And he says, you have to defeat Kamala Harris more than any other people on earth. Israel, I believe, has to defeat her. I've never said this before. I'm thinking Miriam. He's talking to Miriam Adelson, his Sheldon Adelson's widow, big supporter of his campaign. I'm thinking Miriam more than any people on earth. Israel has to defeat her. So there are two things that I think are significant about this. The first is that Trump is speaking to a group of American Jews as if they're Israelis. And this is really part of a long pattern. You notice that he's been doing this for many years. He often, speaking to Jewish audiences, will call Benjamin Netanyahu your prime minister or refer to Israel as your country. And I think this has to do fundamentally with his just kind of ethno-nationalist view of America, that unless you are a white Christian, you are in some sense essentially foreign. So you may remember that back in 2016, I think it was, he called this Mexican-American judge, Gonzalo Curiel, who was actually born in Indiana, he called him Mexican, right? Bunch of years later, he told the people in the squad that they should go back to their countries, even though most of them were born in the United States. So his view is that kind of if you're not white and Christian like him, you are in some sense kind of essentially foreign. And so he sees Jews as essentially foreign and therefore kind of as essentially as Israelis, right? So that's the one thing that's striking about him. And he kind of can't understand why American Jews are voting against him because they don't think he's good for America, because he sees them as people who should be voting for based what's good for what Trump thinks is good for Israel, because he sees them as essentially Israeli or essentially kind of more loyal to Israel than to the United States. But the other part of this statement that's so remarkable is he is explicitly calling on Israel to defeat his opponent, right? And we remember how big a deal it was in 2016 when it was reported that there were private communications, interactions, where the Trump campaign was encouraging the Russians to try to give them information about Hillary Clinton. But this is much, much more blatant than that. Trump is explicitly calling on a foreign government to defeat his political opponent and intervene in the political campaign. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that Benjamin Netanyahu is doing just that. That Netanyahu has a long history of a close association with the Republican Party and of meddling in American presidential elections. And I think one way of understanding what Netanyahu is doing now by launching this war in Lebanon is, I mean, I think there are multiple reasons he's doing this. Partly, I think continuing war helps to continue keep him in power. I think it's also a way of distracting from the fact that there's no prospect that Israel is going to destroy Hamas in Gaza. And it's also a way of distracting from the fact that he hasn't done the one thing that would actually get Hezbollah to stop launching rockets, which is to agree to a ceasefire in Gaza. And Hezbollah said very explicitly they will stop firing if there's a ceasefire in Gaza. But Netanyahu doesn't want a ceasefire in Gaza in part because that would bring down his government, because the right-wing elements would leave the government. But in addition to all of that, right, I think that he recognizes that doing this, starting a regional war, helps to do exactly what Donald Trump wants him to do, which is to make life really difficult for Kamala Harris. Because remember, what is the Trump campaign about? First of all, it's about the economy supposedly being bad. Secondly, it's about the border supposedly being out of control. And thirdly, it's about the world supposedly being out of control. So what could be better for Donald Trump than for Benjamin Netanyahu to launch a regional war and make people think that under a Democratic administration, the world is in chaos. And so you need to bring Donald Trump, I mean, Donald Trump of all people, right, to bring it back to stability. But Netanyahu is serving Donald Trump's interests by doing that. And Trump is explicitly asking him to do this, right? But it's kind of remarkable how because Israel is coded as America's ally, not its adversary, right? You can have these very blatant calls for interference and these actions that I think really do constitute a kind of form of interference. And it doesn't get discussed in the same way that Russia's electoral interference gets discussed. And even worse than that, right? You have the Biden administration itself deeply complicit in the very actions by Israel that are not only terrible for people in Lebanon, and I think terrible for people in Israel, but undermine Kamala Harris and therefore threaten the continuation of liberal democracy in the United States, right? It's just astonishing that a Democratic president who has staked his entire presidency on the fight for liberal democracy in the United States is arming an international and protecting an international forum Israel, as Israel does things that, in addition to being disastrous in a number of other ways, I think, are also disastrous for the continuation of liberal democracy in the United States because they increase the chances of Donald Trump being elected. And Donald Trump is saying, please do this. And the Biden administration is essentially helping Benjamin Netanyahu do this.